Hey, this is Christian again, back with the duality of wrestling. And today, now that we've gotten our introduction out of the way and you know who I am, what the channel is, and what we're going to be looking at, I figured we would delve right into our first area of content focus. And that right now is going to be the Owen Hart Foundation Tournament. I'm going to look at each of these individually. So I'm going to do one specific video for the men's tournament and one specific video for the women's tournament. I think both are disparate enough that they should really be looked at on their own individual merits. I think both the men and the women deserve to, stand as their own entities, which they are in this tournament. So why not do an individual video each for each of the tournaments? So let's start with the men's bracket. Because it's a bit more traditional, I'd say, in the brackets that are, come out typically for tournaments, specifically AEW tournaments. You can really look at what's going on when the brackets are announced and sort of see where things are going. I'm going to start with the two matches that are penciled in for Double or Nothing itself. That's Samoa Joe and Will Ospreay, and then Swerve Strickland and Bandito. They're on opposite sides of the bracket, so none of these winners could meet until the finals. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So Samoa Joe and Will Ospreay. Obviously, there's a massive story being told right now with Will Ospreay and the Death Riders. Ever since the return, Will Ospreay has been intrinsically linked with them, initially coming back as sort of a blood feud with Moxley, and now the dynamic has greatly shifted to where Will Ospreay is much more enmeshed with the faction of the Death Riders than I would have, and I think any of us would have ever really expected coming out of Ospreay's initial return. And then speaking of returns, we have him matched up with the returning Samoa Joe, who hadn't really been seen in AEW since dropping the World Heavyweight Championship last year to MJF in the four-way at the end of the year. So this match has some intrigue in that respect. You've got a former world champion potentially looking to get back into the top end of the card, and you're going to have a phenomenal foil for him to work with in Ospreay, where there's a lot of story being told there. And I'm focusing on Ospreay a bit because all of us have felt, or at least I think the consensus of the internet wrestling community or the wrestling fandom, however you want to phrase it, has been thinking that most of this tournament would be mostly a Will Ospreay coronation leading up to All In, where it's being held in his home country, being held in London. Most people think he'd be the perfect fit to main event that pay-per-view, challenging for the World Heavyweight Championship, and the easiest way for him to do that is to win the Owen Hart tournament. So I'm going to stick with that particular rationale, especially with everything that Will has going on. I think we'll eventually see Ospreay maybe put that contendership on the line against Moxley and the Death Riders as we move forward, but to start at a very basic level, this first round matchup of Joe versus Ospreay, I think Will Ospreay takes this. I don't see there's any way that he drops this to Samoa Joe. Will Ospreay being in the finals last year, losing to Hangman Adam Page, losing in the first round would be a real shock to me, and I don't see that happening here. Moving across the bracket to Swerve Strickland versus Bandito, I think there's a lot of potential here for oddness, but I'm going to go chalk here. I'm going to go Swerve Strickland. They've been building up his program with Bandito. It's sort of Swerve being almost a rebel heel, like why isn't AEW letting me on TV? Posts, why are they blocking me from being who I am and causing the destruction that I am, and really calling out Bandito specifically in advance of this matchup. So I think there's been more build here for Swerve than there has been for Bandito. And great that Bandito has been in the ring over the last 18 months. I will absolutely not take that away from the guy. Swerve is another former world champion. Swerve is a bona fide main eventer. I don't see any way that he loses on pay-per-view here to Bandito. So to me, Swerve Strickland moves on. Going down to the same side of the bracket, we've got Claudio Castagnoli versus Brody King. Either one of these would be a potential Swerve Strickland opponent in round two. I'm going to say Brody King gets the nod here. I think the matchup of Swerve versus Brody is far more intriguing as a rematch from earlier this year at the Revolution pay-per-view, rather than doing Swerve versus Claudio in what would amount to a heel versus heel semifinal. And I also think that you want to continue moving Brody King up the ladder of momentum towards being a full-time main eventer and not somebody who can just pinch hit and play in that sandbox when called upon. So that's where I think Brody King takes this one. He has more momentum on his side than Claudio does. It seems like the company really wants to put him in a better spot, hence some of his booking in recent months. So I think Brody King takes this and will face off against Swerve Strickland again in the semifinals. Going to the last first round matchup, we have Mark Davis, who is now the AEW National Champion, having won that title from Jungle Jack Perry, facing off against Perry, the former champion. So I think there's potential here that this could go either way, because obviously we've seen Perry have wins over Davis in the past. We've now seen Davis get a win over Perry. So really, this is somewhere that could go either way. But in looking at this from a pure, what would the semifinal matchup be? It would be Will Ospreay versus the winner of this match, and I think it makes far more sense from an entertainment and storytelling standpoint to put Ospreay against Mark Davis. Not to mention, Davis has been on fire the last 6 months in the ring. He has been exceptional in every single match that I've seen him in. He's really stuck out and stole the show that separated him from just being another good hand and goon in the Don Callis family to really making his mark on his own, and that's propelled him to his first singles championship in AEW. So this is an area where I think they continue that push for Mark Davis. Davis goes over Jungle Jack Perry to solidify him as a non-fluke champion, and that moves him into the second round to face his former United Empire teammate in Will Ospreay. So just to recap, that gives us the semifinals of Will Ospreay versus Mark Davis, Swerve Strickland versus Swerve Strickland versus Brody King, and that would lead us into looking ahead to the finals. Obviously, I think Will Ospreay pulls out the win over Mark Davis. Davis has a great showing, but Will Ospreay to me is a lock for the finals. And by the same token, I think Swerve Strickland is a lock for the finals too. They're the two biggest and most prominent names here that are most likely to be pushed as regular main eventers. So it just makes sense that AEW would give both of them the win and move them into the finals against each other. Not to mention, there's history here between these two. They were the two men who teamed up at last year's All In to take the balance of power for the EVP status away from the Young Bucks. So there's absolutely an interpersonal history that AEW can play off of here that I think could be very interesting for the tournament finals. So I'm going to say our finals are Will Ospreay versus Swerve Strickland. That's where I see this tournament going and playing out. And barring any kind of shenanigans, and that usually doesn't happen in tournaments like this, I'm going to go chalk here. I'm going to pick Ospreay. I know that's not exactly a hot take. I know that's not exactly something that's going to generate, spicy clicks. But Ospreay is the guy who you want to position as the challenger with momentum. He's got the most story being told right now. He's the most marketable name to use at All In as a challenger for whoever holds the world championship, whether it's Darby Allin, whether it's MJF, whether it's Kenny Omega, whether it's anybody else. The most marketable challenger for London's All In is Will Ospreay. So I have him defeating Swerve Strickland in the finals of the men's Owen Hart tournament. And I think that's where we land here. So, give me a shout in the comments. Let me know what you think. Do you think I'm right in the way I've picked this? Would you say that any of the matchups are different, and would those differences impact your long-term picks on the tournament? Let me know in the comments what you think. Love to hear your opinions. Again, I'm Christian with the Duality of Wrestling, and we'll see you next time to discuss the Women's Owen Hart Foundation Tournament. Thanks for watching.